We should start by saying that
Mhm.
this is not the first time we are having this conversation. So if everybody looks like they're retreading old ground, that's where we are coming from. But you know, it doesn't hurt to have already thought about these things together and basically just be thinking about them again.
Mm.
So, Chao, maybe you could talk to us a little bit about the Museum of British Colonialism. Where did this idea come from? Why the Museum of British Colonialism?
Okay. The Museum of British Colonialism is a big name for a very small group of volunteers working in Kenya and the UK at the moment to realize, document, share, um, include, I mean, just basically bring the suppressed and unknown histories of colonialism to the forefront of the debate. As I said, it's a volunteer initiative and it was started in 2018 by a group of like-minded women here in Kenya and the UK, myself included, who basically came together and realized that despite the fact that we were coming from very opposite ends of the spectrum, and by this I mean some of us being born within, the British Empire, and then others being born in the empire, in Britain, we still knew very, very little about colonialism on each side. Yeah, so it was a bit of a shock for I mean, for us, mostly for those of us who are Kenyan, to realize that a lot of the history that we've been taught about colonialism is abstracted, it's watered down, it's false in terms of it's one-sided. So it was really a chance for us to think, okay, what do we do, and what skills do we have, what resources do we have? And in that way, digital media, digital platforms made the most sense, because they're free, and most of us interact on digital platforms, and we're also working across geographical differences. So we use digital media, digital platforms, and by this I'm not talking about any complex software systems. I'm talking about WhatsApp and Squarespace and YouTube and Sketchfab to share the data that we collect. One of the first projects we did was mapping and documenting the detention camps that were here in Kenya, set up during the emergency between 1952 and 1960. We have an estimate of more or close to 100 camps being set up in the country. And these are detention camps in which thousands of people were detained. But what happens after independence is that they virtually just disappear as camps. They're either turned into schools or prisons, or just they become private property. So we found it really interesting that the presence of so many centers of detention and sites of colonialism are not even documented. They're not even marked. They're not even known. So we have people who are studying in schools that were camps, and the students don't even know that this was a detention camp, that probably your grandfather was held here or your grandmother was tortured here. And I think this dissonance, or this the fact that we as Kenyans, we don't really see this as part of our reality. We don't see colonialism as part of our reality because it's abstracted and it's taught in this very benign. Then Mau Mau fought, and then Mau Mau won, and then we lived happily ever after. And Kenyatta comes in and says we must forgive and forget and move on. But what are we moving on from? What are we forgetting if we don't even know what we're supposed to be forgetting and what we're supposed to be forgiving? So MBC as a space really tries to append and disrupt and subvert the nature of museums by saying that non-experts can do it. And when I talk about non-experts, I'm speaking about us, people who learned of this 2 years ago, 3 years ago. Non-experts can do it. You can have a museum that doesn't have objects. You can have a museum that doesn't have a physical space. And as we move on into the future and we talk about how history is changing, how culture is changing, how the industry is changing, then we must see, is the museum still a relevant space? And if it's not, what needs to change? So in essence, I think museum MBC in itself is a process, but it's also an experiment. And we don't know if this will work or if it's working or what impact it will have. But the only thing we can measure right now is the now, the feedback that people give, the things that people contribute. One of the most incredible things was when someone sent us a photograph of her grandfather's Kipande passbook. that was still very much intact, and she took photos and she just shared them online to NBC. And for me, I don't take those things lightly. I think that's the biggest impact that you can have when you're doing this work, for someone to dig deep into their records in their home, take something that means so much to them and so much to their family, and share it with you because your work resonates with what they feel and what they experience. I think that's an incredibly powerful thing. So in summary, 10-minute summary, that's what MBC is. It's a growing space, it's a process, it's an experiment, it's a platform, it's an idea. It's much more than a static tomb for historical objects.
And during our previous conversation, you did speak about this idea of museum as process, and I wrote it down, but it's also something I've really been thinking about. Like,
Yeah.
what does it mean to essentially embody the museum, to
Mm,
have a museum like gaze in the way we move through the world and the way we encounter history, personal history, our country's history, and so on.
mm.
Your mind, MBC's mind, it amazes me.
Thank you. Thank you. We often talk about, like, we always say, we have this joke where we say that history is a verb, like you history, I history, we all history, and making it a collective responsibility. It's not just something that should be a few people's responsibility. I think if you look even at African cultures and the way history was preserved, like oral traditions, what's really powerful about something like that is that the job of remembering and preserving is everyone's job. Everyone who is sitting there listening to that oral history, you now have a responsibility to keep it and share it. And I think that's what we lost when, this whole divide was, the colonial divide, which said, this is a space for the objects in history and that's where they stay. And you Africans are here, how do we reconnect and reconcile those two things where we were the vessels in which history was preserved, whether it's written or kept in objects? The most primary form of preserving history was through people, and that centers the human experience. So what do we lose when we abstract that and make it that these objects are the history and these people are the people keeping the objects? So I mean, there's a lot to unpack, but for us, it's and for me personally, it really speaks to the nature of going back. Sankofa wise, that to move forward, you have to reach back and you have to look back. So I mean, we'll see how how that goes.
And speaking of history and the museum being, especially in the Western imagination, the museum is a collection of objects that
Mm,
project certain value or certain ideas and so on. We, some of us in the audience will have watched Black Panther, and I know that the return of objects is something that's of interest to you. So maybe talk to us about that, because I know this is something you've really gotten into in the recent past, and that's going to be of interest for those of us who watched that scene in that
yeah,
film and thought to ourselves, well, okay, yeah.
yeah. I
And one
think
of the
what,
things you had spoken about
yeah,
was also that this proved to be an entry point for some people into thinking about, the ownership of objects in museums. Should they be returned? How are they returned? And so on. So talk to us about that.
well, I think the most interesting and perhaps, yeah, interesting, I would say, and profound thing about what Black Panther did, apart from just our imagination of blackness and black histories and black realities, it was that it expanded certain conversations beyond specialist circles. And by this, I'm talking about the conversation on repatriation and return, for some millions of people to see it, but also to see it in a film, in a character that looked like them and that could easily be them and that they could relate to, was striking. And I think it was really, I would love to read, if someone has written a thesis on this, but in the ways in which that particular scene, when Killmonger talks about the return of objects and that they must go back, what it did for people and what it did for us, in the sense that it expanded the repatriation and restitution discussion beyond expert circles. It wasn't just diplomats and museum directors talking about it. It was everyone. It was kids. It was, my friends. It was everyone saying, actually, this is an issue. And one of the things that has come out recently is that there's a strong need for a critical mass, understanding of this issue, that it's not, it's not that repatriation hasn't been happening or hasn't, African practitioners particularly have been working on this for decades. It's not that we've just been sitting there. The people in museums, in academia that have been working on this subject, but it hasn't been accessible to the public in terms of what's happening, why is it important, and what we're seeing now is that this sort of diffusing into public spheres and public conversations, and it's really critical, I think, to move the discussion forward, but also to stake a claim of ownership. That these objects are coming back to people who want them, to people who need them, to people who remember them. They're not just coming back into a void, and I think, just to go back to the point on the human experience and centering the human experience when we talk about culture and history, is that the importance of people understanding, or public audiences, and my friends, my family, you and I having this conversation, is that each of us who has this conversation contributes in one way or another to the fact that these objects need to come home. It's not a debate, it's not a discussion anymore, it's not a what if, it is when. That is the question we're asking: when are they coming back? That's it. And it's beautiful, I think, for me even to be in this position as a young African woman, to contribute to this discussion, because a couple of years ago, and I think this is largely due to just digital media and the ways in which audiences have been diversified. It's sort of like a many to many conversation. It's not just one to museum to audience, it's museum to audience, audience to audience, audience to museum. I mean, the dialogues, the streams of dialogues are so multiple and so diverse that people like us, like you and I, can contribute to this conversation now without exactly being specialists in repatriation for 20 years. There is, I'm not discounting or discrediting the need for specialists, but I'm saying there's room for more, and there's room for us all to fit in this discussion. One of the projects that I've recently started with a friend of mine based in South Africa called Molemo Moilwa is a project called Open Restitution Africa. And we're looking at the role that data can play in making this discussion more accessible to audiences, to stakeholders, because we felt that in as much as we're all having the discussion, there's no central platform to know what's happening. If I want to know how many objects have been returned to Kenya, I'd maybe find a random New York Times article, another BBC article somewhere, maybe something in The Nation. But the fact that we can't see the data clearly, we can't observe the trends, we can't observe the shifts, it prevents us from knowing, one, the bigger picture, but also collaborating and understanding how much progress is being made. So for us, the question is, can we build some sort of like a data platform where information on restitution can be centralized, can be transparent, and can be accessible to audiences at different levels, not just for specialists, but can we have like a platform that maps what's been returned, that talks about best practice, that highlights the voices of African practitioners? Because it's quite interesting that despite the fact that we're talking about African objects, the debate is the voices at the forefront of this discussion are still European. Like when we talk about this, we're talking about Macron, we're talking about the British Museum, like they're still at the center of the discussion, and we need to remove that importance, that sense of importance, because my friend Molemo, she said, we are the ones who have the hard job. We're the ones who need to think about where these objects are coming back to. We're the ones who have to accommodate poisonous objects that have been stored in poisonous substances. We're the ones who have to do the knowledge production. We have, so in this sense of centering, when we center the European perspective of, but do they have objects? We've been keeping them. We've done such a good job. We forget that the hard work is us. It's us who have to do the hard work. The burden on them is to let go of the objects. That's the hardest thing they have to do. But it's us who have to do the groundwork, the grassroots work, the community-based work. So we have to center the voices of African practitioners and understand the complexities that they're facing, because repatriation is not just about return. There's so much more in terms of how we even challenge what museums are. Why are these objects coming back to? Who's going to keep them? Are they just moving from museum to museum? So there's so much, and for us as people who are on the periphery of the industry, and by this I mean that we're not exactly working in museums, but we're supporting and we have an understanding of these two worlds, both in and out, asking ourselves, what can we do to contribute? And I think that's what open institution is, again, an experiment. I look at my projects, most of them, all of them, as experiments, because I think you have to try, and then once you try, then you know, did it fail, did it not? But you do what you can with the resources that you have. And I'm looking forward. Open institution has been alive. It was born like 6 months or so ago. And I'm looking forward to seeing what comes of it as we continue to just try and understand what can we do, what can we build, what can we create. Yeah.
I like this idea of, that thing Toni Morrison said about how you stand at the periphery and you make it the center in your work. And
I love
that's,
that.
yeah, that's a huge part of what I'm hearing, because that is true. Conversations about restitution and repatriation are dominated by Western institutions who are like, but do you people have the storage facilities? Do you people have this? These things are so much better where they are right now, etc. It's a bit like conversations around, say, foster care systems. It's like, these children are so much better where they are. And it's like, oh, what if we created conditions where these children could go back to their families of origin, And that's, I mean, like, there are big conversations that are happening here that are being animated in the museum space. But, there is also like a cultural and social and ideological shift that needs to happen for repatriation to happen. So that's a big task you've taken upon yourselves. We wish you all
Yeah.
the best.
We'll see. I always look at these things. When I started working and just doing all these random projects like the daily project, I always thought that I have to finish, and there's an end to this work. But then I realized that there's no end. You do what you can in the moment that you can, and if someone else benefits from your work and feels inspired to continue it, then you've done your job. There really is, I think, freeing myself from that burden of there has to be an end to this project and it has to be a perfect end. The truth is there is no end. There's no end. There's always going to be something to build. So it sort of makes me a bit more relaxed to just feel like, okay, it'll be fine. Just calm down. So yeah, let's see how it goes.
So you've mentioned in passing, but maybe could you talk about African digital heritage and how it fits into the world of no direct flight? Because I think people will be like, this is film, and this is heritage, and it could be argued that film, in a sense, is a heritage product. It's
Yeah.
an artifact, Like if you watch films from the 90s and you see certain places in Nairobi which physically are still the same but are very different. Like now there's a restaurant there, or now there's a mobile phone shop, and this film was shot at a time when there were no mobile phones. So of course that shop
Yeah.
would not have existed during that time or something like that. So talk to us about how these two things meet and how they fit together. Yeah.
Okay, I think the role that I'm playing in NDF as a partner, as founder of an organization called African Digital Heritage, is to look at the ways in which film and archives, particularly, are being accessed today. Because we're looking at within NDF, we're talking about African aesthetics and the journey towards understanding African aesthetics, and I think film is a big part of that, because film as a medium was the primary tool for empire and colonialism, and spreading colonial propaganda, in the sense that the only visual, actually the only visual reference we have of, or moving footage we have of, let's say, um, African communities in the early 20th century is it 20th? Yeah, early 20th century is these films, so when we reach back to access them, how does it affect us? How does the fact that the only moving image that we can tap into is steeped in this racist, biased, ignorant tropes? How do we take back that power? And that's what I'm looking at within NDF, is the question of the three A's: archives, access, and aesthetics. How are we accessing this material today? What aesthetic does it have? And this is archival footage, and for me it's really powerful to see that when this material is made available, access wise, it's now available on platforms like YouTube, which means you can watch this random film shot in Zambia by this American family on safari in 1933. And you can actually comment and challenge and say, actually, that's not right. Whatever he's saying, the narrator this is actually not even, music from our community. It's Native American music. Why is what is it being dubbed over? So I think challenging and challenging and pitting the contemporary against the archive. It's not about that the African audiences are here and they can't say anything, and the film is here. It's now sort of like seeing this gap close, and they're facing each other, and we're now saying, actually, this is false. That's not the right song. That's not the right name. That's not how you pronounce that. That's actually a delicacy. It's not poisonous. I think that's really powerful, and that's one of the things that I'm exploring within NDF.
And speaking of archives, you told me and this is something you also shared on Twitter. In case the audience is not clear, I am a huge fan of the work of Chao. So, but I was thinking about this recording of people singing some Kamba songs and how archives like this fit into, for instance, the soundscapes we have in films and so on. Could you maybe talk about the experience of sharing this audio and some of the responses you got from people in your audience? Yeah.
Okay. So the audio in question is a series of audio recordings that were recorded in, I think, early 1900s in a place called Machakos here in Kenya. And there are songs from the Kamba community, folk songs, wedding songs, dance songs, celebratory songs, funeral songs, just different songs from the community. And when you listen to them, they're raspy, they're so raw and so real that the first time I came across them, and they were digitized, they were held at the Museum of Ethnography in Sweden, and they were digitized sometime in 2017 and made available online open access, which means you can use them for anything you want. So when I came across them, I remember thinking, wow, this is a perspective I never thought I'd have. I mean, I've seen photographs from the time. You've read the occasional book by the, European explorer. You've seen something in a textbook, but you never actually hear voices. And for me, hearing voices was so powerful and haunting, because it was people speaking for themselves. There's no over narration that dubbed English saying, and now they're singing. Oh, no, 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 no. I don't understand Kamba. It's not my language, but I could feel something. I felt transported back in time just to hear those voices so raw, no filter, no editing, no intermediary, just a song, and that's a perspective I never thought I'd have of, let's say, pre-colonial or just Kenya at that time, because we don't have that sense of connection. And I think it speaks mostly to the power of audiovisual material to connect and to tap into the human experience and understanding. And the responses were fascinating, because I just shared it on Twitter and said, this is a link. I didn't expect it to go viral, in the sense that people were saying, wow, I can understand. I just shared this with my grandmother and she recognizes some of the songs, or I'm crying because I can understand the song. I'm so glad my grandmother taught me my language. And when I think, again, to go back to the question of impact and the impact that digital collections should have, archival collections should have, that's what it should be, that it connects to the people who it means something to. So for me, that was really powerful in looking at access, the question of access and what it does to make archival material accessible. Because we are now in this system where, or just basically looking at the way the Western paradigm of cultural preservation, where it's about hoarding and keeping and observing other people. And to look at what the Swedish Museum of Ethnography did was to make this open access. And I commend them for that, because a lot of museums will digitize and then you have to pay a certain fee. But these records are just sitting there in Sweden for years. No one understands them. No one relates to them. And then 1 minute someone shares something on Twitter, and someone can literally, my friend said that she shared this with her grandmother, who could recognize some of the songs, So I think looking at access, that's what we want. You know, we want records to be accessible, but we also want them to be reused. Let these records be used in, if someone takes this song and turns it into like a you know, incorporates it into one of their songs today, that's powerful. Or one of their films today, or a podcast. That's what you want. You don't just you don't just want archival material to be sitting there, and yes, people can access it, but how can people reuse it? How can people keep this material alive? And I think, you know, access is one thing, but also reuse and making sure that material remains relevant and alive within the minds of people, that's another thing. And that's something that was really powerful from that experience.
Yeah, that's true. I think that's always a challenge. There are people who will say if something is open access, who's going to access it? What are they going to do with it? But if I
Mm,
read a paper, for instance, or in this case, if I watch something, if I listen to something, and
yeah.
even if you use it to make beats, for instance, or whatever, this archive becomes a living object. You know,
Mm,
it's not this dead thing that's sitting somewhere being stored, waiting
yeah.
for. And as you're saying, it's also quite interesting that ethnographers, anthropologists, I was trained as an anthropologist, we are not traditionally known for essentially giving the people who we study
Mm,
access to the things we have said or written or recorded about them. That's not the nature of these things. The traditional way, especially with Western anthropologies, these things are carted off to another part of the world where they're
mm,
viewed as curiosities. While in the place where they're coming from, as in the case of these people who say these songs are
mm,
familiar, these words are familiar, they're
yeah.
they're part of the experience of these people, they're
Mm.
not this alien thing that needs to be studied or
Exactly, exactly.
Mhm, mhm. So lastly, maybe you could talk to us because you're doing so much amazing work, and um, as some of us might be wondering, how do we plug in? Where do we find your work? And related, are there similar efforts in other parts of the global south? There are people who, for instance, come from a French colonial past or a Portuguese colonial past just in Africa.
Mm.
How, for instance, are there similar initiatives going on in those spaces? But after you answer that, how do we plug in and where do we find your work?
Okay, in terms of similar initiatives, of course they are. There's so many, and I probably can't even speak to the ones that I don't know of because I know they're there. But I'm inspired constantly by finding, you know, people, for example, like the Women's History Museum of Zambia, who are doing an incredible job documenting indigenous knowledge, but also shifting the perception of what a museum should be. You know, they're entirely dedicated to women's histories. They're also a digital platform. They're doing podcasts, they're doing animated series, and that's really inspiring. There's a lot of work happening in Central Africa, in Cameroon, in Ghana. There's so much that's going on, and I might not be able to mention it in depth. But I look at, for me, even a social media account on Kenyan history is work that we need to see, you know, and you find this everywhere, like Ugandan history, Rwandan history, archives online, Instagram, people just documenting their culture, and that's the work that needs to happen. So for me, I don't discount anyone working. It doesn't have to, I don't believe that technology has to be technical, you know, to be called technology. It can, you know, it should be relatable to your circumstance and to your needs. And so many people are doing that. It's beautiful to see. As with regards to how people can plug in for the Museum of British Colonialism, as I said, we're all volunteers. And in the way that it works currently, that you just write to the museum and say, hi, these are my skill sets. Whenever you need me, just let me know. And that's what happens. So we just have a WhatsApp group. And then whenever we have, let's say, a project in Kenya, and we need a filmmaker, we need a journalist, we need a lawyer, we need a writer, we just reach back and say, hi, are you able to help in this, or what can you contribute? So everyone, it's really come with what you have approach, you know, and it's quite beautiful to see. So to do that, you just write to info at museumofbritishcolonialism.org. But our website is museumofbritishcolonialism.org, and the material is there. And yeah, with regards to how to plug in, yeah, I think it's what you have and what you can bring. For my work, you can find it on a summary or like a centralized place. You can find it on headstronghistorian.com. So, yeah. That's it.
We love the brand. We really do.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for
Thanks,
making time
Nyambura.
to have this conversation again, for your patience with, I don't know if it's clear, but we've spent so much time juggling and being like, do you have room in your schedule? Do you have room in
Yes,
your schedule? And so I'm so happy that we finally got to have this conversation. It's as great this round as it was the last time. So
thank
I
you,
really
Nyambura.
appreciate you. Yeah.
Fantastic. Thank
Thank,
you too.
thank you.
And